It's time for our next speaker. I'd now like to introduce Executive Director at NRPSI, the UK's independent voluntary regulator of professional interpreters, specialising in public service. He'll speak of the current landscape of spoken language services within key public sector arenas. A very warm welcome, Mike Orlov.
Thank you ever so much. And what an honour it is to be here today. Now, I also have a stack of slides, so let's see how quickly we can get these. Don't chew up too much time with administration, because we've got a lot of work to do in half an hour. There's a lot of ground to cover, and let's kick off. So, what are we going to do today? Well, we're going to look at the current state of play of spoken language services in the main public sector arenas and summarize what it is that we're really looking for to ensure that the public sector gets the best out of public service interpreting, that the public get the best out of public service interpreting, and indeed the professionals who deliver public service interpreting are also getting the best out of the world. Because as we know, we have some real disconnects right now in the UK, and we're working very hard to actually remove those disconnects and create a much better playing field for everybody involved in public service interpreting. Now, the way we're going to do this is spend a lot of time looking at the differences between how different public sector organisations deal with interpreting, because they're not all the same. And they've all been on different journeys to get to where they are today. And that's what we're going to spend the next half hour really focusing on. But before we do that, let's just remind ourselves what the National Register is not. It is not an agency that's out there looking to create business. There are many agencies operate in that area where they are the engagement agency working between the public sector and also individual public service interpreters. The National Register is not a union. It is very heavily involved in standards and ensuring standards are met. Where standards are slipping, then the National Register gets very involved, but it's not a union acting on behalf of members, nor is it an examining body. The National Register does not create examinations. Other organisations, which are very well qualified to create examinations under the regulatory arm of Ofwat, ensure that the examinations, which are vocational examinations for public service interpreting, are actually delivering what they should be delivering. That's not the National Register's job. Nor are we the regulator of examinations either. That's Ofwat's role. So what is it then that the National Register does? Well, there are approximately 400 professional bodies in the UK representing professionals, and there are different types of professional bodies. Sue mentioned some of them earlier today. She mentioned being a member of a learned institute, the Chartered Institute of Linguists, but the CIOL and indeed the ITI, the Institute of Translation and Interpreting, acts on behalf of members driving professional standards. Then there are associations, such as the APCI, the Association of Police and Court Interpreters, or the AIT, the Association of Interpreters and Translators, or SOMI, Society of Official Metropolitan Interpreters. Again, these associations are there to act on behalf of members. And then there are regulatory bodies, some of which are statutory, the bulk of which, within PARN, with the Professional Associations Research Network, the bulk of regulatory bodies are actually independent and voluntary. And they check qualifying registrants. They check their qualifications, they check their experience, they check their clearances, the right to work in the UK, so the agreed professional standards. And that is exactly what the National Register is. The National Register of Public Service Interpreters is your regulator. When somebody carries the badge of NRPSI, you know that they have gained the right qualifications, that they have the right experience, that they've had their credentials and clearances checked, and the right to work already checked. And there's an ID card, and on the back of that ID card, there'll also be a QR code, which will take you straight to the register with their entry. So the National Register is there as a regulator. ensuring professional standards are met. Is public service interpreting an occupation or a profession? Well, serious professions need standards, and that's why we have to have a regulator. Occupation's about doing some work and earning some money to achieve it. A profession is much more than that. Profession's about not just earning money in a specific field, but actually fulfilling three essential pillars. So if you see yourself as a professional public service interpreter, you need to ensure that you've got a high degree of knowledge and expertise in that specific field, and that has been checked through qualifications and experience checks. That you continuously expand your knowledge and expertise, that you get involved in continuous development, as we are doing today, and that you are recognized and trusted through the independent accreditation of a professional regulator. That marks out a professional. So given NRPSI's role, how have we been driving government and public sector organizations to actually get to a stage where standards are being met, the sort of standards that we in the profession wish to see? So the building blocks of doing that are looking at each government or organization, each public sector organization, understanding where they are and their appetite for the regulation of PSI. What's the actual situation that they're in today? What's the desired situation? And then how are we going to go about getting to where we want to be? So what we'll look at a little bit later today is how the particular organizations like the Ministry of Justice, the NHS and the police, how they've got to where they are today, and then where we're going to move from today into the future. So we, as an organization, need to understand each of those public sector organizations and do a gap analysis. What is it the public needs? What is it the public sector itself needs? What do professional public service interpreters need? Level 3 qualifications as well as level 6 qualifications, understanding how that's actually all working within our ecosystem. And through that, we'll have an understanding of what needs to be done, what resources we need to deploy, what people we need to get involved to ensure that we achieve those strategic objectives, which are protection of title, recognition of your status as public service interpreters through statutory recognition, ensuring that you have a mandate to work, and that mandate stretches all the way to the public sector organizations, so that they're only looking to engage with those people who are registered public service interpreters, and ensuring that remuneration is commensurate with your qualifications and with your experience in terms of conditions of fare. So that's the journey we need to go on. A profession has a governing body when the complexity of the service delivery has risk, which needs to be minimized and mitigated. If government doesn't see risk, then it won't move to get to statutory recognition and protection of title. If a public sector organization doesn't see risk, it won't move. It needs to be moved and risk shown to them. Regulated professions ensure accountability of the professional service delivery by those who are registered and regulated. It protects standards. And we've been in a situation where standards have been dissolved like sugar cubes in hot tea over a decade or more. And we have to pull everything back to protection of those standards and a recognition of the value of those standards. Why? For the protection of the public. For those individuals that do not speak English, who face, for the first time perhaps, dealing with the police, they may have witnessed a crime, they may be a victim of crime, they may be accused of a crime. For those people who, for the first time, are facing going into court, either as a witness or as an accused, or for those individuals who are facing desperate health situations and they can't speak English. And there have been far too many instances of people dying through poor interpreting. So standards in public service interpreting are absolutely vital. It protects people's lives and it protects their freedom. If you were to look at a very quick chart, you'd say public service interpreting, was perceived and still is in some areas as nothing other than an occupation. We need somebody who can speak another. Oh, you'll do, you can speak the language, why don't you come along? The worst example I know of is a GP practice in the East End of London where a Bengali receptionist told a Bengali mother to bring her 15-year-old son in to a gynecological consultation. It's the worst example I've come across. That's so wrong on just so many ways. Limited regulation, where it's a budding profession. Standards are being set. And if you really needed a start date for our profession, you'd look at 1994, when the National Register was launched under the auspices of a royal commission at the request of the judiciary, with Nuffield Foundation money, seed money to launch it. It was the beginning of public service interpreting being seen as a profession. And public interest merits greater regulation. And we've seen that happen, and we'll look at that in as much detail as we can within the time that we have. Self-regulation by the profession, we're certainly knee-deep in that now. If you have a level 6 vocational qualification in public service interpreting and you have 400 hours of experience and you've got the right clearances, then you can voluntarily choose to be self-regulated. And that's been available since 1994. There will come a day when mandatory engagement will happen because of statutory recognition of public service interpreting as a true profession. And that's what we're working to, and the journey to achieve that. Now, some public service organizations are further along that curve, others are further back on the curve. And it's all driven by frameworks. Now, what are these frameworks and how do they affect us? Well, we're going to look at what a framework is. We're going to explore how many there are, and we're going to see how they differ and what this actually means to you. So what are they? Well, frameworks handle the procurement in a particular sector of different things that sector buys, language services being one of them. And it sets standards for the procurement management in what they should be doing to ensure that they are fulfilling the framework's definitions. And that defines how much you earn, your remuneration. It defines terms and conditions. So how many are there? Well, Crown Commercial Services, CCS, is a pretty standard government framework which schools or councils, and indeed historically some police forces have used. Its competitor is the Eastern Shire's purchasing organisation, the ESPO framework. Then there's a range of sector-specific frameworks in the Ministry of Justice and Her Majesty's Courts and Tribunal Service. There's the dynamic purchasing system for the police-approved interpreter and translator scheme. And within the NHS as well, there's a whole range of different frameworks. So these frameworks are important. And what these frameworks do, as we said, is they set standards. They set how a particular public sector organisation should and can go around purchasing that particular standard. Now, ESPO is an interesting one. If you ring ESPO, it has one of these recorded messages where if you're buying furniture, press 1. If you're buying stationery, press 2. And it lists all the way down. And before it gets to language services, it's about item number 96. Item number 96, if you're buying language services, press number 96. That's how ESPO sees language services. It's just that purchasing stationery or purchasing paper clips. And the ESPO framework allows people who have enrolled, not even qualified, but enrolled on a level 1, which is a GCSE course, enrolled on a level 1 course to act as an interpreter. That's the ESPO framework. So where they're starting from is they see interpreting as an occupation way down the scale. And interestingly enough, in my years at the National Register since 2019, I've never been able to have a sit-down meeting or a telephone call or a Zoom call with ESPO management about those issues. Crown Commercial Services is very different. Crown Commercial Services, its last 2 iterations have changed and actually we're beginning to see their standards increase. Not yet to where we want to be, but they're getting better. But let's spend some time thinking about the Ministry of Justice first, shall we? Let's have a look at the Ministry of Justice. Well, there are many here who will know what happened in 2011, 2012, when outsourcing was first introduced by the Ministry of Justice as a reaction to the austerity demands of the then Cameron government following the financial collapse of 2008, 2009. You've got to find ways to save money. You've got to find ways to save money. Contracted out to ALS, a disaster. Contrasted out to Capita TI, a disaster. Still currently the framework with the big word. Outsourcing the engagement function, so therefore the courts and tribunals could no longer needed to have people who were actually doing the engaging, but more than that, actually outsourced the list of interpreters which can be deployed in MOJ settings. Now, the question is why? Well, because it's a phrase I've used before, I will use it again. They have dissolved standards with this framework like a sugar cube in hot tea. You know, we mentioned earlier ESPO. The ESPO framework allowed people who had enrolled on a level 1 course in public service interpreting. Well, this particular framework allowed exactly the same, so that if you'd enrolled on a level 1 course, you could actually go and work as an interpreter in bail hearings, in first hearings, in case management sessions. That thankfully has recently been changed, but that's part of the journey of the MOJ in reacting to lobbying pressure. There was an event in 2019, before I joined the National Register. It was the 25th anniversary event, and the Ministry of Justice came along to present. Now, some of you here I know were there at that event, and the presenters from the MOJ were absolutely mauled, and they were surprised. They were surprised at the negative reaction from everybody who was there at the event. They needed their eyes opening to everything that was wrong with their framework. And for 2 years of lobbying, all the way through to 2021, had many, many meetings. Sadly, they replied by saying that actually our suite of contractual measures are fine. There's no wholesale issues with our service. The same applies for every single bit of everything that we do with our MOJ register, which included people who had enrolled on a level 1 course. So all the work that we put in for 2 years, they threw it away. They said, no, we're not interested in change. Well, we need to reaffirm the importance of professional practitioners in spoken language public sector language services. So we started what was called an MP campaign. We encouraged every single registrant to write a pro forma letter to their MP and get their MP to ask questions about what was going on in public service interpreting in the courts. We then ran an ad campaign with the answers that we got back, comparing what the courts were doing with what the National Register was setting as standards, the professional was setting as standards. Baroness Cousins picked up this banner in the House of Lords. She's the co-chair of the All Parliamentary Party Group on Modern Languages in the Houses of Parliament. Baroness Cousins, with her colleagues, gained a commitment from the Ministry of Justice to an independent review of where they were. So it took a year from when we got that email saying there's nothing wrong, we're not going to do anything. It took a year to get the MOJ to say, actually, we ought to have a look. They released their draft proposal a year later. You'll see some comments soon about this from the Professional Interpreters for Justice consultation. They published their proposed new framework for review in May of 2023. And actually, they've come a long way. There's much to be appreciated, but there's still much to be done. We understand that the ministers in the Ministry of Justice have agreed this new qualification and experience framework. However, what they're saying is that contract tendering process needs to be reviewed, so therefore they're still going to outsource. Cost analysis need to be done. things might change. However, they've accepted that this new framework that's being suggested is a framework that they should get behind. And the proposed new framework says that the default now is a level 6, so university degree level, vocational qualification, typically a DPSI, and 200 hours of evidence experience, which they'd never had before. They didn't have this before. Now, that's a massive shift from the current framework, massive shift. It's raising the bar on the level of qualifications and experience an interpreter will need to have to work in Ministry of Justice settings. Doesn't deliver on everything that we want, that we're lobbying for. We will continue to lobby. The Professional Interpreters for Justice signed off on this in February of last year. This new framework will not come into operation until October 2025. So we've still got some way to go. They're still operating on the old framework. Until then, we're still going to get people who have language-related degrees, language-related diplomas, BA in modern languages, a BA in translation, a degree in linguistics, and a degree in philology. All these people are accepted as interpreters, as well as some lower qualifications. So we're still chipping away at each one of those. We're still encouraging the Ministry of Justice to get to October 2025 and introduce this default of level 6 with 200 hours. Let's look at the police. Well, the police held for the first time ever last April National Police Interpreter Awards on the back of the launch of the police approved interpreter scheme, the PATE scheme, and through the DPS, which is the purchasing system, the dynamic purchasing system that they use. And we have to offer special thanks because clearly this is a recognition that public service interpreting is not just an occupation. Now, there's much about the PATE scheme that we wish to address and change. However, once this scheme was introduced, which is in 2021, we actually got to a situation where at these awards, winners and runners-up had NRPSI numbers, had NRPSI numbers, had NRPSI numbers. So it's a recognition within the police awards. And here you've got Baroness Cousins handing over the Simon Cole Award for Excellence in Police Interpreting. It's a recognition that public service interpreting is a profession. Now, we haven't yet got to a stage where the police in every police force has recognised the National Register, but it's recognised the standards. It's recognised the standards that you need to have a level 6 qualification and 400 hours. It hasn't recognised the need that we ought to have independent professional conduct committee and disciplinary committee hearings. We know, of course, that the Metropolitan Police does, and the Metropolitan Police recognises the NRPSI, and the Metropolitan Police makes up a huge proportion of the engagements within the police. Other police forces hopefully will move further along, because we want to ensure that the quality checks and disciplinary processes are run independently. We want any individual public service interpreter to be able to complain without fear or favour if they feel something's going wrong. We want to ensure that there's a clear understanding between the commercial agencies that are being used within the PATE scheme about somebody who's got the qualifications, who's got the experience, and therefore they should be on all the lists across all the country. Rates, terms and conditions need to be addressed. Consistency across the UK is what we're fighting for. And we're fighting for badging with the QR code on the back to ensure transparency. Transparent professional conduct and disciplinary processes also need to be put in. And of course, the MPPV3 vetting has to be mandatory for police. Now, the police have moved a long way. If you think again of that arc, it's not just an occupation. We haven't yet got to mandatory independent regulation, but at least they're taking the default standards of a level 6 qualification and 400 hours of experience. So that's a big shift for the police. Now, I know that I'm going to be running out of time soon. And when talking about the NHS, we could take the rest of today about this. Because the NHS has a number of frameworks. There's the North of England Commercial Procurement Collaborative. There's the Shared Business Service Framework. There's the Black Country Framework. There's the NHS Interpretation and Translation Services Framework. There's a primary care guidance framework. There's, would you believe, there's one particular framework that says we'll train you for 4 hours and then you can go and work in the NHS. 4 hours training. 4 hours to be a professional public service interpreter in the NHS? I don't think so. And worse than that, if you can read this, it's basically saying that the receptionists in this practice, it's a GP practice, receptionists in this GP practice will no longer act as interpreters, have never been trained. And therefore, could you please bring along a family member or a friend? And we wonder why people die because of poor interpreting. Don't take my word for it, take the BBC's word. We'll talk about something about the BBC in a second. And each of these frameworks define it differently. And these allow each and every NHS trust to act the way it wishes to trust, be it a hospital or be it in primary care. So lobbying the NHS, well, we've written goodness knows how many letters to gain interest from government, from shadow ministers, also to the CEO of the NHS. A very tragic death caused a reaction, a death that really caught the imagination, actually, of this country, a lady giving birth in Gloucester. And we got a reaction. We also use the same technique that we used with the MOJ, where we wrote pro forma letters for NRPSI registrants to pick up and write to their MPs for the MPs to ask questions. And there was an avalanche of reaction on this, with MPs asking whether their constituents were safe if they couldn't speak English when they're in the NHS. There was a lot of that activity through this last year. And there are some NHS guidelines now that actually state that you should first and foremost go to the NRPSI. You should find somebody with a DPSI health as your #1 choice. Should, not must, but it's a move in the right direction. But they're allowed to do what they wish. More follow-up letters, and it's led to an appointment for the first time ever, a lead for language services across the whole of the NHS. There was a whole series of pre-meetings and quite a major meeting on the 9th of November where there were over 40 CEOs of different NHS trusts, an amazing BBC programme on the 21st of November on File on 4, which I would encourage you all to actually hear. And we're getting to a place where the NHS are taking language services much more seriously. Now, how far we will go, no idea. But you rest assured the National Register will continue to give voice to standards, to experience and qualifications, to ensure people are professionals who are deployed, to ensure that there's fair remuneration and that terms and conditions are fair. So what do frameworks mean? They set our standards. They set the terms and conditions. They set the remuneration. They set the relationship actually with agencies too, because outsourcing is not going to go away. We might not like it, but it's there. And therefore we need to work well with agencies. And there's a fantastic working together document put together with the ATC, which is the trade body for agencies, which is well worth reviewing. But we want to see rates which are standard 2. Now, police work at the moment, thanks to the way in which they've embraced all the standards that the National Register fights for, have gone up. Rates in the MOJ absolutely need to change, as do the terms and conditions. And my goodness, 17 pence a minute for a phone call in the NHS, that's definitely got to change. That just shows that with each public sector organisation, it's different. With each public sector organisation, they're travelling on a different, they're travelling on the same arc, but at different speeds. And one of the main roles of the National Register on behalf of every public service interpreter is actually to carry the flag for standards, mandating the use of only those interpreters who are registered and regulated, and ensuring that remuneration is commensurate with the qualifications that you have and the terms and conditions are fair. And that's the way we'll bring people in. There's a continuing increasing need for standards and professionalism in public sector language services. We need to ensure effective regulation of those acting as interpreters, but we need to ensure also that the public sector organisations understand what needs to be done. And in fact, Baroness Cousins only last month in the House of Lords said it's a non-negotiable bottom line must be that only specialist qualified experienced professionals are engaged. And the Bishop of Leeds in the same debate said this is why the National Register is so important, and that was reported in Hansard. I think I'm probably out of time.
No, perfect timing, Mike. Perfect timing.
I could go on for the rest of the day. Why? Because we have a passion for those people that we love who do not speak English. There's someone today in a police custody suite, in a court, or sitting scared in a consulting room, and the interpreter's not good enough, and we need to do something about it. At least with the police, they've accepted level 6 and 400 hours, and they're doing it now. MOJ is not doing it yet, and the NHS has still got a long way to go.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for your insightful presentation, Mike. I have a question for you. Based on your advocacy, you know, you're making great efforts and pushing things forward. How about you know, is the NRPSI also contributing to the effort of promoting the acceptance of commercial requirements at a feasible level for SMEs to compete? Otherwise, it's only going to be accessible to large corporations and limited companies chosen by UK authorities. I know there's a certain level of, you know, how much money needs to be turned over before bidding can be done. So I was just wondering if you give a brief response to that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. One of the great joys of the role that I have is when lots of organisations have all got the different agendas and they're kind of pulling apart, and yet it's like a Venn diagram. They come together. This bit in the centre we can all agree with. And working with the trade body for agencies, the Association of Translation Companies, which also includes interpreting companies, and agreeing what we really should be lobbying for includes ensuring that there's the right sort of remuneration for the agencies and that it's a fair playing field, that it's not just global organizations which are owned by American venture capitalists that can actually bid. That there should be openings for smaller agencies to be.
How can that be implemented? How can that be addressed?
Well, it can be addressed by government changing policies. Now, government will only change policy when there's risk. We had a letter from the government back in 2019, which stated that there's no point in driving for statutory recognition of public service interpreting because there is no appetite in public sector organisations for this, i.e. public sector organisations don't want this because they want to be able to do just what they want to do. So therefore, nice big fat contracts, nice big supplier. It is easy to do with just one agency. Just happens to be this agency may well be owned by a venture capitalist company in the US, right? Government's changing. And indeed, there's going to be a massive change of government, we see, because we're going to have a general election soon.
That's right.
Things are going to change. If government has a desire to encourage small and medium-sized businesses, which we can only hope that our next government will, if government has a desire to protect residents in the UK who don't speak English when they're interfacing with public sector organisations, then government's going to pick up all the lobbying we've been doing and move quicker with it. As to the how, that will come down to months, if not years of negotiation, but at least we should get that started. What I've found encouraging is that you've had everybody from the Chartered Institute of Linguists, the ITI, plus the regulators, so NRPSI and NRCPD for sign language, with associations, come together with the industry body for agencies to come up with agreed principles. And we're all lobbying off the same sheet. It's quite different to what it was just some 7 years ago, where everybody was pulling apart. We're actually pulling closer together.
Okay, thank you, Mike. Really appreciate that, and you know, your advocacy efforts really appreciated amongst the community, I'm sure. Thank you. Thanks for your insightful contribution.